no surprise that newsmakers try to manipulate the audience. They want you to believe that they are the one holding the line and they'll use any trick they can to get you there. But don't let them fool you. Get unspun. I'm Amanda Sturgill. I've been a reporter, and today I teach future reporters to cut the spin and think critically about what newsmakers say. My podcast, Unspun, shows you how to know when you're being manipulated by the news. Learn to spot the tricks and how to make up your own mind about what's true. So if you're tired of being fooled by the news, subscribe to Unspun today. Unspun, because you deserve the truth.
Our press secretary gave alternative facts to that.
My goal in this deposition was to be truthful, but not particularly helpful.
Welcome to Unspun, the podcast that makes you better at finding the truth. The way people get news is changing. It used to be that there were many reporters who would research stories and write articles, but now politicians and famous people share information directly with you on social media and the internet. That means you find out things fast, but it's up to you to make sure the information's actually accurate. And newsmakers don't always do their part. The temptation to manipulate information is strong. They bend the truth to deceive so that they can avoid accountability, so that they can advance their agendas. When you recognize these agendas, you can sometimes find out what's real. And we're at a crossroads where anyone can share anything online, so it's important to sharpen your critical thinking skills. Finding that deception before it goes viral is pretty much a survival skill now, and we're going to do it together. Let's get unspun. Hi, Truth Seekers. Welcome to this week's episode of Unspun. This is another Journal Club episode, and this week's paper addresses something really important. If your social media feed is curated by algorithms, does it actually affect you? And that's pretty important, right? Because algorithms are a way of life, and they were created in part to make social media use better. But researchers have noticed a lot of bad effects about organized feeds. One effect everybody thinks about is if it changes your political views. So can social media actually do that? We'll find out more about that in this episode. So let's get unspun.
So political data analytics, communication is fundamentally changing, and political communication likewise. The idea of blanket advertising, that is where hundreds of thousands or millions of people receive the same slogan or the same message, has been replaced with ever more granular and personalized individual communication. So political data analytics is really using big data, using targeting and addressable advertising technology to serve increasingly relevant messages to the right audiences through the right channels at the right time.
That was Alexander Nix. Nix worked with a company called Cambridge Analytica that did this kind of political data modeling. And here's a quote from him speaking in 2017 at a seminar in which the interviewer asked him if he was actually responsible for both Brexit and Donald Trump getting elected. The amount of information that he claimed his company had was pretty shocking. In 2016, he was quoted as saying, quote, "Today in the United States, we have somewhere close to 4,000 or 5,000 data points on every individual. So we model the personality of every adult across the United States, some 230 million people." That's the end of the quote. Cambridge Analytica started in 2013 and was part of a larger organization that was already involved with political campaigns all over the globe. The company collected the detailed data and then tried to use it to predict people's personality traits. So it might be that they were fearful about things like losing their job, or it might be that they really valued their family, all kinds of different things. But they would use these models that they had built to target these political messages based on the kind of person it was going to. And by 2014, the company was involved in U.S. politics and was working at congressional and state levels. For example, it was pretty involved in Ted Cruz's campaign when he ran for president. And honestly, that was kind of the point when it became seen as a serious player in American elections. By 2016, its role had expanded and it was very involved in Donald Trump's first presidential campaign, as well as I said, Brexit. Now, the company claimed that it could figure out which voters might change their minds, and it could then deliver messages that were likely to do that, right? Likely to make them change their minds. So maybe this is concerning. Political campaigns have always tried to win voters over, but this kind of approach suggested that it was something more precise, almost as if they were messing with people psychologically. So instead of spending a lot of money sending the same message to everyone on TV, campaigns could spend a little bit of money, maybe $15 on a Facebook ad that just went to people based on detailed data about their behavior and their personality. In 2018, Channel 4 in the UK, as well as some other news organizations, bought these practices into the public view. There were reports that the company had gotten Facebook data by pretending to be an outside researcher, and they got information from millions of people who had not consented to share their information in that way. In Channel 4's big report, there was undercover footage that showed company executives describing things they would do to help clients, which included importing prostitutes from other countries, hiring ex spies, and more. So, some really serious ethical things. And that reporting did have some impact. Facebook banned Cambridge Analytica, there were investigations in the UK, and in just a couple of weeks, the company just shut down. But in a way, that was just the start of this issue. It didn't disappear when the company did, because when you saw that story, you got public attention about systems that might make this kind of targeting even possible. Now, you know that social media platforms collect large amounts of data, right? They know everything you look at and for how long. They know who your connections are. They know what you're likely to share with someone. And social media platforms also rely on algorithms to decide what content is going to show up in your feed. So we can talk about Trump and we can talk about Brexit, but there's also been concerns about this kind of targeting all over the world, especially in elections. In Brazil in 2018, WhatsApp was used to deliver these kind of targeted messages. In India, different parties used social networks to do this, and similar in the Philippines. Online campaigns that influence the way that people are thinking about politics. And if the whole Cambridge Analytica thing makes you feel slightly nauseous, it may be because it points to something that's even bigger than just one company. Social media might be changing you and your thoughts and the way you relate to people and even how you act. Now, of course, you're not the only person who's thought about this. Researchers have spent years trying to figure out whether that concern is actually valid. And a lot of that concern is about those algorithms that show you what you see when you open an app. For you holding the phone, it's a black box, right? You can see what's in your feed, but you don't know how it got there. And because of that, it's hard to pin down exactly how much influence they have. So here's a couple things researchers have looked at. One of the first ones was the idea of filter bubbles. The argument here is that once an algorithm knows what you'd like, it's going to show you more of what you like because that keeps you on the platform. And that means that you're not being exposed to new perspectives. And over time, maybe, because you're always getting your viewpoint reinforced, you start finding other opinions threatening. Researchers will call this affective polarization, where people develop stronger negative feelings about people just because they disagree with them about some things. Researchers have also looked at the type of content that spreads the most easily in these environments. Now, we always have to remember that media companies are, first and foremost, businesses. And what's the goal of a business? It's to make money. That's why they exist. That is their mission. And so, in a social media platform, you make money by selling access to your audience for advertisements and promotions. And that way, you get more money by keeping users on your platform longer so that they see more of those promotions. Because it's a business, they have an incentive to show you content that's going to keep you engaged and attentive. And this can mean posts that are enraging, that are misleading, and in some cases are just not accurate. I'm recording this on April 20th, and I saw one of these today. I saw a commentary video on Instagram, and the person was commenting and saying that the President of the United States had shared a video where someone was anointing him with blood and there was a cult chanting. And I looked at that and I thought, I can't imagine that's real. But I did actually have to go and look at the Truth Social feed for the president to see that, unless it was something that had been deleted, no, that wasn't real. But it was definitely attention getting. It would make me concerned if the president was sharing this kind of information for like any reason, really. So you can see why a fake like that would spread around because it gets that reaction. So researchers have worried that the dynamic of wanting to make money lets misinformation and fake news just travel really fast. And when it does that, it reaches large audiences who may never see a correction. So, kind of related to that is a question of tone. When content is inflammatory, it gets strong reactions, and strong reactions tend to guide engagement. When algorithms are learning from that engagement, they can end up just amplifying posts that are toxic. And of course, all of this matters because of how central social media is to the way people get information. We've talked about this on Unspun before. A substantial share of adults rely on social media for their news, at least some of the time. And in particular, people do tend to get political information there. So when algorithms decide what you see, it's more than organizing content. They're actually creating an information environment that people are using to make sense out of the ways that we live together. And at the same time, there's a big gap between what maybe people suspect and what research has been able to demonstrate. Anecdotally, a lot of people believe the stuff I've talked about, But I wouldn't say all of it's really backed by strong evidence that one thing causes another. It may represent what researchers call a folk theory, right? An intuitive explanation that feels right, but citation needed. Still needs to be tested. So that brings us back to the study for this week and the central question for this episode. When an algorithm curates your feed, is it just organizing the information, or is it actually changing how you understand your world? Well, let's talk about algorithms. At the most basic level, they do solve a practical problem. I don't have a huge outgoing engagement on social media, but on some platforms, I'm still connected with several hundred people. And when that's the case, it's a lot more people than I can realistically keep up with. When Facebook first introduced its algorithm, it was pretty common for people to have more than 1,000 connections or Facebook friends. And back at the time, people used to actually post on Facebook a lot. And it was a lot, and you couldn't keep up with it. And if you just have that information in a chronological list, it's overwhelming. You miss important updates, and there may be things you actually care about. So an algorithm steps in and it kind of sorts the information for you, and it predicts what you're the most interested in. And I feel like that's pretty benign. The algorithm is a kind of an organizer that helps you manage information overload. But there's also a business reason behind it. Social media platforms make money by keeping your attention. So an algorithm allows the company to shape the way that you're experiencing the content in a way that keeps you around. It'll show you stuff that holds your interest and get you to click and forward, and those things, it might not show you stuff that might cause you to leave. So the system is not neutral. It's designed with a goal, and because it's designed by a business, again, the goal of a business is to make money. And we can even extend this. Once the platform knows that you're likely to engage with it, it can give you new stuff that fits those patterns. So if you follow a Facebook group about frogs, the system might suggest a group about salamanders. If you watch romantic movies on Netflix, it's going to recommend similar ones. In any case, the system is not just organizing what you've already chosen to see, it's shaping what you see next. So it is deciding what to introduce into your information environment, and that is where those lines start to blur. Now think about it. The same logic could apply to political information. If the algorithm learns what kind of political content you engage with, it can recommend more of it. It can show you posts that align with what you already believe. It can introduce people who maybe push those views just a little bit further. And over time, your feed becomes a mix of what you chose and what the system selected for you. And at this kind of concerning level, it's close to what people were afraid of with Cambridge Analytica. It's not that the information is sorted or recommended, but that it's tailored to nudge your thinking. You can design messages for specific audiences, and they'll show up at the right time, in the right tone. And, that's an extreme version of this concern because algorithms aren't just helping you navigate information, they are shaping how you interpret it. And so we can ask, where do these algorithms fall on that spectrum? Can they actually change your mind? I need to take a very quick break, but when I come back, we'll get into this week's paper on the topic. Be right back. Welcome back. So, this week's paper looks at that big question of whether getting your news from an algorithm can change your mind. It's called The Political Effects of X's Feed Algorithm, and it's written by researchers from a university in Milan and a team of co authors. So, as we've talked about, people have worried for years that social media algorithms might shape political beliefs. But there was some research a few years ago that tested that idea on platforms like Facebook and Instagram, and they really didn't find a lot of evidence of that. So, it raises a question. If the algorithms are so powerful, why don't we see clear effects when we remove them? In this paper, the authors think about the problem a different way. They ask, what happens when you turn the algorithm on? And they also consider if maybe being exposed to an algorithm early on might have effects that last for a while. To test that idea, they focused on X. That's that thing that used to be Twitter that Elon Musk bought. And when they did the study, users had a choice. They could look at their feed chronologically, which showed posts from accounts they followed in the order in which they were listed, or they could look at it algorithmically, which added and reordered content based on the system's preference. It was nice that that choice existed because it meant that researchers could do an experiment with real users using real Twitter. This could be a better idea than bringing people into a lab when you want results that are really close to what reality is. In a lab, you can control things, but the naturalness can also teach you some important things. So these researchers recruited thousands of users in the US, and they assigned them to use one version of the feed or another for 7 weeks. Some of them started with a chronological feed and changed to an algorithmic one. Others made the switch the other way. And then the researchers looked at several outcomes. They tracked how much people used the platform, inside of their feeds, how much of that content was political, which accounts they followed, and their political attitudes. They also asked them about their views on some issues, including the war in Ukraine, criminal investigations into the president, and some other political policy stuff. Now, this design is important because it goes beyond just observation. The researchers created conditions that let them estimate if there was cause and effect. If two groups of users end up with different attitudes after using different feeds, you have more confidence that the difference is due to the algorithm. So, if the algorithms really do change political views, if you put people into an algorithmic feed, it should change the way that they think. So, they did find that the algorithmic feed increased engagement. I guess you could have predicted that because I don't think Twitter would offer it unless it was making them money. But this research kind of confirmed it. They found that the people who switched from a chronological feed to the algorithmic one, they spent more time on the platform and they also interacted more with posts. But the most important findings are about political attitudes. When the users switched from a chronological feed to that algorithmic one, their political views shifted more conservative on some issues. They said topics were more important that were emphasized by Republican politicians like crime and inflation and immigration. And they were also more likely to say that criminal investigations into the president were politically motivated. They even expressed views on the war in Ukraine that were more pro Russia. They weren't like massive changes for every individual person, but you could definitely find it across the whole group. And some things didn't change. They didn't find that people changed their mind enough to change parties, for example. They also didn't find that effective polarization or thinking badly about people who are not like you. People didn't report dislike more toward people who thought differently from them. So, in other words, the algorithm didn't change who you were politically, but it did change how you thought about some issues. And there was another result that was just as important and could explain why some of those earlier studies didn't really find that much effect. When they looked at people who started in the algorithmic feed and they shifted to the chronological one, they did not have those changes. Turning the algorithm off didn't shift political attitudes back. And that's probably important because it suggests that the influence that an algorithm has over you might build over time and last even when you're not under the algorithm. Once you expose users to certain kinds of content, their information environment doesn't just reset. And of course, there's another question that comes from this, which is if the algorithm changes people's attitudes, how does that happen? So the researchers looked at what the algorithm was actually showing to people. And when you looked at the content in the algorithmic feed versus the chronological feed, it was really different. The algorithm feed focused on posts that already had high engagement, meaning they got more likes, reposts, or comments. And you would expect that, right? Because the system is designed to keep attention. But that wasn't the only difference. The algorithm also showed more political content overall, and even within that, more conservative leaning posts. And at the same time, posts from traditional news organizations, those people who fact check, there were fewer of them, and posts from political commentators and activists, there were more. And that changes the tone of what people see. The researchers also looked at how their participants responded to the environment. People who had the algorithmic feed became more likely to then follow particular accounts that were linked with conservative political activism. And that's a big deal because the accounts that you follow are going to shape your feed even when you don't have algorithms. Once a user follows a new account, that account's posts will show up in their feed more often, even if they later go back to the chronological. And so that may explain why the shift only works in one direction. But the important thing is that the algorithm doesn't just organize information right now, it actually can change the structure of your network. So we can go back to our bigger concern. Does it make a lasting change? Now, at this point, it would be easy to jump to a big conclusion and say, well, this looks like a clear case of influence. But the authors suggest that we should be cautious. The changes are real, but they're not overwhelming. You're not seeing people changing their party affiliation, for example. So it shows up in how maybe people interpret specific events, but it's pretty limited. And there's some constraint in the study itself. So, as I said at the beginning, the experiment lasted about 7 weeks. And so you could see short term changes, but we just don't know if that effect would last over months or years. And also, of course, it focuses on one platform at one specific moment in time. I don't think X even works that way anymore. But even with those limits, the study does something important. It lets us know that it depends on what you're measuring. One study can get you started, but if you stopped here, you'd see that party identity likely would not change, but smaller actions and beliefs might. In a previous study, users only went from algorithm to no algorithm and they found little effect, and so this study does add to that. But as we know, we've got lots of other studies to look at together. And I hope you'll come along with me, truth seekers. Until next time, stay sharp. Thanks for getting Unspun with me this week. Unspun is a production of me, Amanda Sturgill, and is a proud member of the MSW Media family of podcasts. Send me your thoughts and ideas about trickery in the news on Gmail at theunspunpodcast@gmail.com. I even write back. And find this episode's show notes and more information at theunspunpodcast.substack.com. Want to learn more and get smarter? Check out my book, Detecting Deception, Tools to Fight Fake News, which is available on Amazon or your favorite online bookseller. And until next time, stay sharp, everyone.
Tired of sugar-coated news and corporate spin? Check out The Nicole Sandler Show. Speaking truth to power with the irreverence it deserves. Smart, fearless, and just the right amount of snark. Nicole breaks down the headlines, exposes the hypocrisy, and talks with the people working for real change. Weekdays at 3 Eastern, noon Pacific on Progressive Voices, NicoleSandler.com, Substack, YouTube, or wherever you get your podcasts. Don't just get the news, get the truth.